So just real quick before we get started, I just wanted to kind of quickly introduce myself, introduce the group, kind of what this group is all about, and then introduce our special guest tonight, Alexandra, or better known as Alex, um, who's going to join us tonight. We're going to talk about 1031 into syndications, but my name is Ryan Gibson. I'm the Chief Investment Officer with Spartan Investment Group. We have a regular syndication simplified meetup. We talk just about passive investor education every other Thursday. So the next meetup is going to be in 2 weeks from today, and it'll land right on Thursday, November 12th. So what we do is we focus just on passive investor education topics. We don't talk about how to flip houses or wholesale or anything like that. We talk just about the nuts and bolts to doing a real estate syndication. The reason why I picked this topic is because we are constantly asked as syndicators and real estate developers, hey, can I 1031 exchange my rental property into a syndication? And we always say, yeah, I think you can, and then you sort of get a bunch of different answers, and the $1 million question is going to be answered tonight, and we're so fortunate to have an expert, Alex Garza, kind of guide us through the semantics. Not to take words out of Alex's mouth, but basically she said, you can do it, but it's highly technical, I think is what you said. And there's a lot of steps along the way to doing it correctly, but it is possible. So anyway, but before we get into that, I just wanted to give you a disclaimer. Anything that you're hearing tonight is not cannot be used as legal advice. Seek outside counsel. Do your own due diligence. This is just friendly conversation. So please seek your outside counsel advice. Again, what is Investment Syndication Simplified? This is simply a meetup group that is virtual for now and also will be in person when COVID has sunsetted a bit. And the goal of it is to increase investor sophistication, networking and community, potentially look at quality opportunities, and see real project site visits of syndications and projects at some point. What is a syndication? It could be anything from a real estate development to a Broadway show, to a movie, to a self-storage, residential, multifamily. It's basically the heart of American business, Main Street investors investing in Main Street projects and giving you the opportunity to partner with a team that has experience in a field that is able to accomplish the mission of completing a project and earning a return. So kind of moving back into the slide, we've got Alex tonight. I'm going to go ahead and introduce her a little bit. She has over a decade of legal and government relations from various Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit organizations, and she's guided multiple clients from the Western region states through legal, public policy, and political processes, and have done a variety of different industry sectors, which is great. To include real estate development, healthcare, transportation, telecommunications, natural resources development, hospitality, energy production. But her specialty is in real estate law, legislative and political law compliance, and additionally, her experience includes being an advocate for new laws through rule hearings, commission membership, makeup, agency stakeholders, advocacy, grassroots organizing, and procurement procedures. So she's done quite a bit in this space, and under the, she does all of our title work, kind of reviewing from our side of the house, title exceptions, helping us do due diligence on property closings to make sure that we don't misstep in having something necessarily excluded. So anyway, without further ado, Alex, you want to say hello?
Good evening, everybody. I'm excited to be here. Real estate has been a passion of mine for many years. So allowing investors and property owners to take advantage of all the various tax laws that we have to be able to grow their wealth is something that I'm extremely passionate to be here and looking forward to it.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and just dive right in. Usually what we do is we do the presentation and then we have a little bit of opportunity at the end for Q&A. And what I do is I unmute everybody and it's just kind of an open dialogue at the end. So what is a 1031 exchange? Alex, if you could summarize that in like a couple of sentences, what would that look like to you?
So a 1031 exchange, it's 1031 refers to an IRS tax code that allows a taxpayer to sell investment property without having to pay taxes on any of the. What you're doing is you're preserving the proceeds for another purchase. And what you can do is you can continue to sell and purchase property as long as it's a like-kind property without having to pay taxes on any of the gains. One of the great things about a 1031 exchange is that when someone's estate ends, so essentially if that individual passes away, that those proceeds go to their heirs and they start all over. So all of those owed taxes on that capital gain to build wealth.
Very good. And, I think that's kind of what leads us to the next point. I think a lot of people are familiar. I'm assuming people are familiar with a 1031 exchange as a savvy real estate investor, but probably where we're going to wade into, a deeper level understanding tonight is just, are you allowed to put it into a 1031 exchange, into a syndication? And there are some rules, but we're not going to go through all of these tonight, but can you kind of just, Alex, kind of highlight a little bit about, just some of the basics on rules?
Sure, absolutely. So general rules for 1031 exchange is that any cash proceeds that you make from the relinquished property must be reinvested. Or take something out, you just have to pay taxes on the difference. You want to get a qualified intermediary involved prior to selling your relinquished property. And then you want to 1031 into another property. At that point, it may be too late because the proceeds from the relinquished property have to be held by a qualified, and there's paperwork that needs to happen at the 45-day point to make sure that all of the proper check marks are checked when it comes to the IRS and the qualification for the deal. Another important one is that the purchase price of the replacement property has to be at least equal to or higher than the relinquished property. If it's not, then the difference is going to be taxed. Another kind of key element is that if there's debt that an owner has that they would like to bring along with them, that's a possibility. So that's not a disqualifying factor in a 1031 exchange when you try to. One of the most important ones is that you have to purchase like-kind real estate and be an owner in like-kind real estate. The good part about that particular rule is that the definition of like-kind is a fairly broad definition, which includes everything from single family, multi to statutory trusts, so that's kind of the bird's eye view of the things somebody would have to meet in order to qualify for a 1031 exchange.
Yeah, and I just wanted to hammer on something that I think is really important that you mentioned, the like-kind exchange. It doesn't mean single family rental into single family rental, or self-storage into self-storage. It simply means like-kind. So if you are having a rental property, you can roll that into another rental property. So you could go single family into self-storage. You could go single family into multifamily. You could go, it's like-kind and is kind of a broad term. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's absolutely right. So a lot of times people think like kind, it has to be a single family for a single family, but you can take an oil and gas and 1031 that into an apartment building. So that there's a wide variety of projects that you can invest in. And one of the other things I think we should probably mention is that so I've seen investors take their funds and pick up to 3 properties that they want to co-own and participate in a syndication, and that is absolutely fine for a 1031.
Excellent. Yeah. So, don't, you look at this and it says all cash proceeds and, it must be a like kind, just make sure that, if you're thinking about doing this, you really understand that because, sometimes, if it's just, it might just be the difference that you don't invest is the cash is what gets taxed. And like kind is pretty generic. So, when you're thinking about doing something like this, don't assume automatically that you're disqualified. Talk to an attorney like Alex. And I would say probably the most important person, as soon as you start thinking about selling property that you might 1031, as Alex mentioned, get your qualified intermediary like on speed dial. Call a QI company like 1031 XP or another qualified intermediary and get them in the loop on what you're doing, so you can sort of set up your account. And I would ask your QI if they carry errors and omissions assurance. So if that they do something wrong or give you some misguidance, you could be covered by their insurance policy. So just a little tip there. So let's just take a step back here for a minute. And I just wanted to highlight something. For a typical syndication, as a limited member, you technically do not own the property. You have a interest in the LLC that owns the property. So, I just wanted to kind of make that clarification because when you think about a 1031 exchange into a syndication, if you say that to somebody, they might say, you can't do that. And technically, they're correct. Because if you were to 1031 exchange capital into the syndication, right, the LLC that is, or the entity that's set up for the investment purpose, that LLC has a bunch of investors in it and is a new partnership. And that entity necessarily isn't, or that entity is going on title, but the ownership interests are within the LLC. So can you 1031 into a syndication? No, but you can 1031 exchange into the ownership of that property. Did I say that right, Alex, or anything to add to that?
You are right on. So when you own shares of an LLC, that's considered a securities transaction, which is why you would do it through a private placement memorandum. In this case, what we put together is a tenants in common agreement, and you are essentially a co-owner with, and that's how you're able to own a portion of the property and make sure that you meet all the qualifications required for the 1031 exchange.
Absolutely. And yeah, and I'll never forget the first time I called a QI with an investor who was thinking about 1031ing into a property. I said, hey, we're trying to get this guy's 1031 into a syndication. He's like, well, you can't do that. And I'm like, I think you can. And then we talked through the semantics and he was like, well, he can own the property with you, but he cannot own the part of the syndication. So like Alex was mentioning, that's that TIC agreement, that tenant in common agreement that you would have so that you could join in the ownership of the project, but not the syndication side of it. So just wanted to stress that. So Alex touched on this just a second ago, but 1031 exchange must be a co-owner of the property. And the TIC is an ownership in which 2 or more people or entities own separate shares of the same real property. So I've kind of got a little graph or a pictorial here of kind of what that looks like. So the bottom left, you see the 3 people, the little syndication Wi-Fi symbol there, and that's the syndication, and they own an interest in the LLC, and then the LLC owns an interest in the ownership of that building. And here comes a single person who's 1031ing proceeds, and they go directly onto the tenant in common agreement that owns the title to the property versus going through the typical syndication. And that's sort of how the TIC kind of comes together versus going through the syndication like you normally would. So we got I did see a question kind of coming in, and we will address what you've asked in just a second. So tenant in common agreement. Alex, let's kind of jump through this one. What's some of the kind of the do's and don'ts of what you would expect to see in a TIC agreement?
So a typical tenant in common agreement in a syndication is going to mirror the operating. So even though you are co-owners of the
So Alex, you're really coming in pretty choppy. Can you look in the invite, see if you can call in maybe?
I'll be right back.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And I'll kind of keep talking
okay.
Through this, and we can kind of come back with a Q&A. So anyway, the tenant in common agreement, while we wait for Alex to come back, basically each owner takes a undivided interest in the property. So you're co-owners. This isn't a partnership agreement going into a deal. This is you are an actual owner of the deal. So in a typical syndication, you kind of come through the partnership agreement and the syndication documents, and like Alex was saying earlier, the PPM and the whole investor subscription process. But you, as the TIC, have to hold ownership in the property through a tenant in common. And it typically mirrors what the operating agreement gives you. So if you're looking to 1031 exchange with Spartan is going to arrange the tenant in common agreement so that it mirrors sort of the distribution and profits of what the partnership would normally get for that passive investment. So, Alex, are you back?
I am back. Is it any better now?
You sound great.
Okay, awesome. Perfect.
Yeah, so go ahead and pick it up where I left off.
Right. So a TIC agreement will typically mirror the operating agreement. So even though a 1031 exchange, the owner of that is a co-owner of the property, they're almost treated exactly like a passive investor is treated in a typical syndication. So the sponsor is the one that would have the power to make decisions as to, additions to the property, potential sales of the property, or any kind of day-to-day management. And typically, someone that wants to do a 1031 exchange, that is what they prefer, is somebody that has the experience to be able to manage high-class properties like that. So that kind of takes us to our last point, which is where your voting rights and limitations, and that will all be spelled out in the TIC agreement. You will get monthly reports, quarterly reports of how the property is doing. So typical things that would happen in a standard syndication, except they're specified from an ownership perspective.
Great. So we're going to talk about timelines and just some advice that I like to give for people thinking about doing a 1031 exchange. And obviously, this isn't something that you would do in a market where you're desperate to sell your property, or it's more of a buyer's market than a seller's market. But if you're in a really hot market and you want to sell your property, negotiate with the buyer that you get extensions to actually go to settlement. So let's say you've got a hot piece of property, maybe in Washington or Seattle or something, or Colorado, and you know that you're going to have a good market for it, and you put it on the market and it goes under contract in a day. You might negotiate with your buyer to have closing extension options that you can exercise so that you don't start this clock until you have identified property. Because as this timeline lays out, the day that escrow closes, so this is you're sitting at the settlement table and money gets wired to you and the settlement closes, you've got 45 days to identify your upleg or your investment property. So if you can delay that closing until you find a property, it might just take a little bit of pressure off you. I see a lot of people out there that get into this situation where they've got 45 days to ID and they're just trying to find anything that they can get their hands on. And that's just a great way to make a bad deal happen, right? You're under the gun, you're trying to make a pressured decision. So try to give yourself as much wiggle room as possible before you start that 45-day clock. Alex, can you kind of talk a little bit about, I've always wondered, like, how does somebody know how you've registered what your upleg property will be within that 45 days? Who do you have to tell when you identify that property? Who do you go on record with that?
So that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons why a qualified intermediary, we call them QIs, would get involved in the beginning of a transaction. So before you even think about selling the relinquished property, because they are the ones that are going to keep track of all the documents that have to be submitted at the 45-day mark. They're the ones that are going to walk you through the process of what's required and all the pertinent forms required to file on the 45th day. Because what happens is if that deadline is not met and the property, the new property is not purchased, the QI will keep the funds and will actually have to pay out taxes on those funds before they're able to release them back to the investor. So it's a serious process, and they're held to a lot of different rules, but the QI is who's going to keep you on track for all the different qualifications.
Makes sense. Okay. And of course, 180 days to close the property. So you've actually got to close and settle on it. So let's just get down to a realistic scenario. So you've got 1031 property, you extend it. Maybe a syndication pops up that, hey, I want to buy into that syndication. You connect with that operator, you agree to a tenant in common agreement, and that syndicator, assures you that that property can close within 180 days. That could become a problem if it doesn't. So it's just a risk that you take if that property doesn't close within 180 days. So just something to consider. What about debt? So we've got a couple of questions actually in the Q&A here. Number one, debt to follow along. How does the debt follow along? Is that something that has to be done together with equity? What if you don't bring the debt along, but only the equity? Does that affect the exit later? So lot of discussion on debt here. Alex, do you want to kind of tackle this one by one?
Sure. So initially, if you bring the debt along, a lot of lenders are absolutely okay with that. What they do is a process called bifurcation, and they will bifurcate the loan, and that particular loan that you bring with you, that amount will just be in your name. However, the percentage in ownership in the property is based on the equity that you bring and not on the debt. So that loan that you're carrying is not going to hold a percentage of ownership in the property. And different lenders will either bifurcate or do an entirely new note. It just depends, but just know that that is not a deal breaker from the 1031 standpoint. It's just that the equity will be divided a little bit differently if you do bring debt with you into a 1031 exchange.
Awesome. And, this is kind of interesting, is that the cash that you put in kind of has to determine your ownership on the title. Can you kind of talk to that a little bit? How the equity counts towards the ownership on the title, but not the debt?
Right. So let's say, we have your requirement at 1031 is 500,000. That's what you sold your relinquished property for. You have a $200,000 loan that you're bringing with you. So your percentage in the new investment property is going to be based on the 300,000 in equity that you're bringing with you, not the 200,000 loan. So it would be divided just slightly differently versus you bringing in the entire $500,000 in cash.
Great. Yep. Good example. Now, one question, that I've always kind of had a misunderstanding on is, what about signing on the loan? So now you're an owner on title. Will you have to sign on the loan as a co-borrower along with the syndicator?
Potentially. Another great question. So there are actually a lot of very good things that come along with that. So typically in situations like these are non-recourse loans. So they're not going to be showing up on credit. But the lender, because you are a co-owner, will want to underwrite you, and you will have to sign some documents pertaining to you being an owner in the actual property, and you would want that anyway. But at the same time, you also get, I guess, what they call is a history and experience from a lender perspective of being involved in projects like this, which will allow you to obtain financing much easier now that you've had experience. So a lot of investors, pay people to be able to go in on a deal like that and have that experience behind them with a lender on, a multifamily or any of the larger commercial projects. So there's a lot of benefit that goes along with it. But typically these are non-recourse, so your exposure is limited to if it's in an LLC. If your 1031 is in the name of an LLC, which I would normally recommend, your exposure is limited to your funds in the LLC. So that's another great thing that comes along with having it in an entity type structure.
Yeah, and sometimes the lender won't require you to sign on anything. If the ownership is too small or typically less than 10 or 20%, the lender may not have to underwrite you. Is that your understanding? So it's not all cases.
Correct. So it's kind of a lender by lender decision. And usually I've seen if it's under 20% of ownership, the lender, you will obviously have to be on title and sign all the title documents. But as far as having to underwrite you, they do not require them.
Yeah, so a great question to ask your operator that you're considering to do a syndication with is saying, hey, I want to upleg, 500,000, would you accept that amount? And if you preferred not to be a lender, then you could ask what that would do to the ownership of be a borrower, what that would do to the total ownership and how that would impact you having to sign on any loans. Or you could say, hey, what kind of debt are you taking on the property? I'd like to place, $1 million or $2 million, whatever it might be. And that loan might not be something that you wouldn't mind signing on. But then the operator may have some questions for you, like your creditworthiness and your ability to get loans, because you may hurt the partnership based on your background, or you may bolster it in some cases. So, and you might want to ask, is it recourse or non-recourse lending? Is it, and then kind of evaluate the project, because you're potentially taking on that risk. So just a lot of questions around debt on, whether or not you would have to sign on a loan or not. And by limiting the amount of funds that you invest, it may push you below a certain ownership percentage, which wouldn't require you to sign on any loan. So the big answer there is it depends. Just one real quick question, Alex. While we're you gave the example of having selling a property that had a $200,000 loan on it, and then you had $300,000 of proceeds that you had to roll into your up leg. That debt can just be simply paid off and taken away, right? That doesn't have to roll into the new project or anything like that, right? That debt can just be paid off at settlement.
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
that is an option.
Okay, gotcha. Great. So let's talk about the paperwork. So, once we get to the closing table, we're preparing title documents. What are some things that, you would typically see that would have to get executed before this got all buttoned up and made official?
So we've got the tenant in common agreement, which is going to lay out all of the terms. And like I said before, those typically mirror the operating agreement. One other document is a limited power of attorney, which basically gives the sponsor limited power of attorney in regards to the property. So any documents that they need to sign, you may not want to get emails or phone calls from them every 2 weeks, so that it gives them the ability to sign on your behalf. And there's thousands of situations that come up afterwards where they would need to do that. And other than that, those are really the only two. Your QI will have some documents in addition to that, but from the syndication perspective, those are really the two additional ones.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of highlight that limited power of attorney. As an operator, we would want that just to basically do our day-to-day activity and keep you passive. We would want that ability to sign on documents, transact, kind of do the things that we would normally do in a syndication without having to involve you in everything. And as a passive investor, I wouldn't want to be involved in everything. So, that really covers a lot of the bases there. But I had a really good question here. Does the TIC ownership provide any liability protection for the investor, like a syndication LLC interest, if the investor exchanges in their personal name rather than under their own LLC? Does the TIC doesn't provide you any protection? I don't think it would. Or is
Excellent question. Not the TIC itself. In projects like these, your first line of defense would be, premium insurance. So the operator that you're working with will likely have above and beyond insurance on the property. That would be the first line of defense. The second line, for asset protection purposes, my recommendation would be doing a 1031 in the name of an LLC that's property specific. If you're an individual and it's in your individual name, at that point, your asset protection kind of dwindles, but you still have that insurance as the front line of the operation.
Excellent. All right. So that's pretty much it. That we pretty much nailed all of it tonight. We do have some good questions, and I want to get to all those. So first, I'm going to go ahead and usually what I do, if you don't want to talk, if you don't want to turn on your camera, that's totally fine. I do open up the last 20 minutes or so of Q&A to allow people to talk. So I'm going to bring everybody into the meeting and, kind of make a little bit of a online community here. So if you don't want to be on this, that's no problem. But I'm going to go ahead and just get everybody into the group. If you want to mute, feel free to mute. But I wanted to kind of turn it into a discussion for the last few minutes here. Let's see. I hope I got everybody here. And again, if you don't want to be heard, then don't say anything. And I think I've got I think I've got everybody in here. Allowed to talk. And why I'm doing this, Alex, the first question that we had, or one of the questions that we had here was on depreciation, and I don't know how much tax background you have, but talking about depreciation that was taken in in a real estate transaction leading up to the sale, is that let me see what the exact question is. How does that depreciation get recaptured in the 1031, or does it get recaptured or taxed when you do a 1031? I think that's the question. Yeah.
Excellent question. I like to defer those to the CPAs because each situation is different. So unless you have something specific, Ryan, I prefer to punt those to our CPA friends.
So we have a CPA friend on the line. Does the CPA friend want to take a crack at that one? Maybe he's not on the line anymore, but we do have a CPA on the line. Let's see if he's still here. I don't think he's still here. Mr. CPA, do you want to answer? I won't call you out by name. Oh. Okay. Well, we'll defer to that. We'll defer that one. So I have another question for the, let's see. How does a 1031 tick exit upon a syndication sale? How does the 1031 tick exit at the sale of the syndication? Is that also equity and debt as well? Are there any differences when you enter into a tick with a syndication compared to exiting at the sale with the syndication?
Nope. So you are still a co-owner of the property, and you would still have to meet all the 1031 requirements as you did before. So now it would be the syndication tick would be your relinquished property, and you would get your QI involved. And as long as you are you have a like-kind property in mind for the replacement property, you're good to go.
Awesome. All right, another Q&A. Can someone take proceeds from a DST and 1031 into a syndication?
Yes.
That's an easy answer. It always seems like it's a yes, but.
Short and sweet. It's rare when that happens, but when it does, it's great.
Yeah. Very good. All right. And hopefully this 1031 exchange stuff doesn't get touched in the election. There's been a lot of talk about it, but hopefully it kind of stays in place because it's a nice rule here. What dollar, so this is a good question. Maybe this is mostly for an operator. What dollar amounts are needed to make a 1031 tick investment make sense? So, it's kind of interesting. So, if you invest too much, you might trip yourself from having to sign on loan documents. If you invest too little, the operator may not find that it's worth dealing with the extra paperwork involved in the transaction. So I would always say that it depends. If it's if the operator is raising $1 million and you have $1 million that you'd like to roll forward, if there's any loans on that property, there's probably a really good chance that your ownership is going to tip so much that you're going to have to sign on all the loans. So I would probably say it depends, and have a conversation with who you consider investing with and see if that deal is a right fit. And it kind of goes back to the alignment of the stars. Do you like the deal? Can you roll as much money as you want into the syndication? When does it make sense? And sometimes it might make sense and sometimes it might not make sense. So I would say it probably depends a lot. Let's see. How does a refinance in year 2 in a syndication affect the 1031 tick and issues, or is there any issue at all?
Wow.
Another great question. Yeah. So, in a refinance, there is no issue. So it depends on how your debt structure is laid out. If you are refinancing your own portion, versus the operator doing a full refinance on the financing on the entire property that they took out. But ultimately, the funds from a refinance would not be subject to tax.
Makes sense. Yeah, refinance for return of capital. Yeah.
Right, because then what will happen is when the owners sell the property, all of that is going to be recaptured in the sales price. And then your new 1031 would have to be that equal sales price or more. Otherwise, you get taxed on the difference. So that's why any cash out on a refinance would not be taxed at the time of the refinance.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, that's a pretty awesome strategy. You know, you take tax deferred money from a 1031 into a syndication, and then that syndication refinances out. You get your money back, and you tax deferred in, and you refinance and take money out tax deferred as well, or tax free. You know, for the time being. So, yep, double your money working for you. That's exactly it. So pretty savvy. So you know that's another thing. It's ask your operator what the refinance problems are or refinance plans are. You know, it just depends on the deal, right? I mean, and everything's a projection in a syndication, so you know, it may not go as planned all the time, but there might be a plan to refinance pretty quickly. Question: is Spartan typically doing 1031 exchanges on their project exits, or is it more likely that tax would be due 5 years when there's a sale? So we have never done a 1031 exchange on the exit. And Alex, my understanding is that if we were to 1031 exchange the partnership or the group out of a sale of a property and into a new property, that pretty much all of the ownership in that TIC would have to stay the same, right? There couldn't be any changes. Is that accurate, Alex? Or if we were to sell, you know, a storage and roll it up. Oh, I think we lost her. But yeah, I think we lost Alex. But yeah, my understanding is that you know, if you 1031 exchange into a property, you have to, you know, so let's say you're like, hey, I want a 1031 and do a Spartan deal, and you say, okay, money comes in, we set up the TIC, and everything's great. Then 5 years later or 4 years later, the property sells. My understanding is that your little TIC can go identify new property and go off on its own and continue 1031ing because you ticked in, so you'll tick out into something else. If you came in as an individual investor into the syndication and we decided as a partnership, hey, does everybody want to stay on? We're just going to roll these proceeds into a new deal, and everybody agreed to it. We could 1031 exchange an upleg into another investment. You know, if you can pull that off, the stars have seriously aligned, I think, because everybody's agreeing, and then you all find property that you agree on. And right when you're selling the property, you have another property to buy. It's kind of a strong alignment of the stars. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, 1031 is great. It's sort of like it just all kind of has to line up. You know, I definitely wanted to talk about it, but you know, we get a lot of questions on it. And frankly, we've worked with multiple people on trying to 1031 exchange into our projects. And there's probably about 10 different reasons on every single time why it didn't work out. So, you know, that's why we wanted to have this education session to talk about, you know, how it works so that, you know, we can replay this and kind of review this. But, you know, you really have to, you know, your settlement date actually has to happen. You know, we've had settlement dates delayed. We've had, you know, owners realize that they have so much depreciation from other assets that they really don't need to tax defer, and they just would rather hold on to their cash. There's a lot of different reasons why it wouldn't work out, but if it does work out, it can be a pretty big benefit. So, or we don't have a deal that they don't like, or a number of different reasons. So, let's see. Is there any reverse scenario where reinvestment property can be identified purchase first and existing property sold at a later date to roll proceeds into a new property? So I believe, yes, I think that's a reverse 1031 exchange in effect, where if you sold a property or if you're investing in a property, then you could sell the property afterwards and then reverse 1031 exchange that money. We didn't really go over that tonight, but that is a strategy that you can employ. Are there any additional fees to members joining as a TIC for additional paperwork? I would probably say it depends. I wouldn't say that they're extensive fees. I would probably say if the investment was a healthy amount, and depending on the totality of the project and your involvement, I would probably say no. If the fees were, if the investment was maybe smaller or wasn't as significant, there might be some attorney's fees. We would pay Alex, for her time to prepare the documents and make sure everything was, T's were crossed and I's were dotted. We would expect you to pay your QI. I don't think we can even get involved in that. So you'd have to pay your QI. And I've heard QIs aren't they're not that expensive. $500 to $1,000 a transaction. So I don't think you're paying a ton of money for that. Does Spartan have a minimum amount you're willing to do for a 1031 TIC for a deal? We don't have a set minimum, but it's usually higher than our standard minimums of 50,000. So again, depends on the project. Alex, you're back.
I am.
Let's see. There was a question in here that I really wanted to ask you. Can you kind of speak to the reverse 1031 exchange scenario? I kind of glazed over it, but yeah.
You can do a reverse 1031. Those tend to be a little bit more expensive just because you're kind of having to backtrack and create LLCs and entities. So those tend to have a little more fees associated with them than if you were just to do a forward 1031.
Yeah.
And don't let the timelines scare you. These happen all the time, and the timelines are met. Another kind of fun fact that I wanted to mention is that you can also 1031 into a new construction project. So it doesn't have to be something that's already in place. That the technicalities of a new construction are a little bit different than a straightforward 1031, but it is an option.
Gotcha. Yeah, and we can't stress enough. You've got 3 people involved in this transaction. You have your QI. That's the first person I would engage. Then I would engage your personal CPA and your tax strategist. I would make sure they're involved, and then I would engage an attorney. So I would, don't anything you hear on this is just to sort of wet the whistle, so to speak. This is sort of just to get your kind of get some ideas out there on stuff. I can't stress enough. Don't take this as legal advice. Go out and make sure you hire the right people to make sure this goes. And a QI is probably your first stop shop, because then they can really help guide you and make sure you make good decisions. We just wanted to kind of throw this webinar out there to let you know that it's possible, and sort of some of the players in the space that help folks do this. So there was a message I saw. Make sure that we that you talk to your tax attorney. So absolutely 100% correct. Yeah, most syndications, I think it's like a $400,000 to $500,000 minimum. I'm not going to really hang myself to a certain minimum here. I think we take it case by case, and I definitely think there would be a maximum, depending on their willingness to sign on the loan and the credit worthiness. But I think that the minimum would be higher than what our typical minimums are. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, kind of an art to how the deal is structured and things like that. So, great. Any other questions? If I missed your question, if you could just ask it again and I will answer it. I'm trying to look through these. Okay, somebody just Q&A'd up. Check the chat. Yep, there's a Q&A and a chat. I wish they would just combine those two things. Let's see here. All right. This was my first year receiving K-1s. I was told by my CPA I couldn't take advantage of those deductions until I sell the property since I'm not actively involved. How does that change with regard to a TIC? Interesting. Good question. K-1s, that depreciation, and this is a different webinar for a different conversation, but my understanding of the K-1s, you can use that depreciation against passive income, but if you're not a real estate professional, you can't use it against active income. So for example, in the first year of a syndication, you're typically going to get a loss due to depreciation. That can shield any taxable distributions that you have on that investment in that year or in subsequent years. It'll roll over, but you can't use that depreciation against your W-2 income if you're not in the real estate profession space. And then as far as it changing in regard to a TIC, Alex, do you want to take a stab at that one? Does it matter if you're a limited member versus in the TIC for tax purposes, or did you want to defer that one to a CPA as well?
It is CPA specific, as it just depends on your case. But as far as the income that you're going to have as your ordinary income from the property, that's taxed at an ordinary income level. And then once your property appreciates and you sell it, at that point, you're able to record the depreciation of it. So in other words, when you sell your property, all of the ordinary income that's been paid out to you is not included in the value of it.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah. And, as a TIC owner, you would receive probably the taxes based on your ownership of the deal. So, or ownership of the property as well, tax gains or losses. But we have another question. Would Spartan provide indemnification to a TIC in addition to insurance coverage for property level liability, i.e. environmental? It's an interesting question. I think my attorney's on.
I can't see that one. Will you read that one again?
Yeah. Would Spartan provide indemnify the TIC in addition to insurance coverage for property level liability, for example, environmental?
I don't see why not. It's definitely up for discussion. As a co-owner, those would be very rare, because if there's any kind of financing on the property, there's an extensive environmental study performed that's required by the lender. But that seems to be a reasonable request, as you guys being the operators.
Yeah, digesting that question just kind of on the fly, we wouldn't want to have any more liability to the TIC than we would the partnership and the syndication. So I would lean towards yes. The idea is that you are passively investing, tax deferred money through the means that we have to follow, instead of doing it through the partnership to provide you with that advantage. So we wouldn't want to pile on any additional liability that outside of what we normally do. So I would probably say yes to that. Yeah, no problem. Good question. Man, this has been a great dialogue. I've learned a lot just from the questions that are getting answered or asked. So that's great. Let's check the chat here, make sure there isn't any other questions. We usually try to keep these to an hour. We do record these, by the way, and we put them on our YouTube channel, Investment Syndication Simplified. And all of our previous webinars are also on there. Please make us feel good about ourselves and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You get some updates. So, oh, and I got some comments from CPAs in the crowd. If you're not an RE pro, real estate professional, you can still take up to $25,000 loss if your income is not too high, 100K phased out by 150K, and offset other passive income sources, present or future, or take it against the eventual gain on sale of that or a different real estate activity. Hey, Tony, I will introduce you to our accountant for great advice offline. I'll send you an email. If that didn't cover it, it was kind of gibberish to me a little bit. I think I kind of understood it, but it seemed like you can take some of that loss now, but not all of it. A QI that figured this, let's see. A QI that figured this out and charged for a streamlined hand-holding system to get syndication investor through, this would be very well. Yeah, would do very well. Yeah, I agree. I think if the problem is, I think, you know, I've called QIs and, you know, it's like an issue of semantics, but the intention is clear that, you know, you want the tick, you want to roll it into a syndication, but, you know, it's just how do you get through the technicalities. So that's why I wanted to host Alex, because she's very familiar with this process. Alex isn't a QI, but you know, but can help you through the specifics on doing this if you wanted to do this into a syndication. So, well, with that, we're pretty much at the end of our call. We hope everybody joins us next time, and we always have a really fun topic on syndication. We go into the nitty gritty on something that sharpens your axe. So when you're looking at a passive investment opportunity, you can really understand what you're getting into, going in eyes wide open, or maybe increase the strategy. So, you know, really appreciate everybody coming out. Like I said, this will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel within a few days. And we hope everybody has a great night. And thank you, Alex, for your time, and appreciate you helping me put this together. So,
my pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, guys.